On the 26th of November, 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter made a small hole in an ancient sealed door deep in the Valley of the Kings. He held a candle to the opening. Behind the wall, darkness, more than 3,000 years of darkness. His sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, standing beside him, asked the only question that mattered. "Can you see anything?" Carter answered, "Yes." "Wonderful things." That exchange was written down. It was remembered. It was quoted in newspapers around the world. But those 4 words were only the beginning. What Howard Carter found over the following weeks, months, and years was not a single golden mask, not one dramatic moment, but an entire burial, packed with objects, sealed in time, waiting in the rock beneath the Theban hills. This is the story of that discovery, told not as legend, but as history. What was found, when it was found, and why it still matters more than a century later. Welcome to Echo of Empires. To understand why the discovery of 1922 was so important, we first need to understand where it happened. The Valley of the Kings lies on the west bank of the Nile River, across from what was once the great city of Thebes, modern Luxor. For the ancient Egyptians, the west was the land of the dead. The sun set in the west. The dead were buried on the western side of the river. Beginning around the 18th dynasty, roughly the 16th century BC, Egypt's pharaohs stopped building the giant pyramid tombs of earlier ages. Instead, they cut their tombs into the cliffs and hills of this valley. The logic was simple: hide the burial, make it hard to find, protect the body and the grave goods from robbers. For nearly 500 years, generation after generation of New Kingdom pharaohs were buried here, from Thutmose I to Rameses XI. More than 60 tombs have been found in the valley. Some are vast corridor-like systems cut deep into the mountain. Others are small and unfinished, but almost all of them had one thing in common. By the time modern archaeologists arrived, they had already been robbed. In many cases, robbed repeatedly. In antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in the 19th century, when treasure hunting was barely distinguishable from archaeology. Gold was taken, jewelry was taken, even the mummies themselves were sometimes removed or destroyed. So when Howard Carter began searching the valley in the early 20th century, he was not looking for just any tomb. He was looking for something almost no one had found in modern times: a royal burial that was still largely intact. Howard Carter was not born into wealth or academic privilege. He was born in London in 1874, the youngest of 11 children. He did not attend university. He did not have formal training in Egyptology. What he had was practical skill and patience. As a teenager, he was sent to Egypt, where he worked as an artist, copying tomb paintings and inscriptions for archaeologists. He learned by doing. He studied the art of ancient Egypt with his eyes and his hands. He learned to read the landscape of excavation sites. He learned how tombs were built, how they were sealed, and how they were robbed. Over the years, he worked with some of the leading figures in Egyptian archaeology. He became known as a careful, experienced excavator, not a showman, not a treasure hunter. By the time he partnered with Lord Carnarvon, Carter had already spent decades in Egypt. He knew the Valley of the Kings better than almost anyone alive. And he had a theory. George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was Carter's opposite in almost every way: wealthy, aristocratic, a collector fascinated by ancient history. Carnarvon began funding excavations in Egypt around 1907, initially near Thebes and later in the valley itself. The partnership worked because each man brought something the other lacked. Carnarvon brought money. Carter brought expertise. Together, they searched the Valley of the Kings for years. Season after season, they cleared rubble, examined sites, and found little that justified the expense. By 1922, Carnarvon was frustrated. He told Carter that this would be the final season. If nothing significant was found, the funding would stop. Carter asked for one last chance in a small, unpromising area near the tomb of Rameses VI. The ground was covered with debris from earlier excavations and from the construction of nearby tombs. Other archaeologists had assumed there was nothing left to find. Carter believed the area had never been fully and systematically cleared. He was willing to gamble his reputation and Carnarvon's patience on that belief. On the 4th of November, 1922, Carter's workmen were clearing rubble in that triangle of ground below the tomb of Ramesses VI. Then they found something unexpected. A step cut into the bedrock, then another step, and another. By the end of the day, 12 steps were visible, the upper portion of a descending stairway. Carter immediately ordered the work to stop. He had seen enough tombs to know what this meant. Someone had cut a passage into the rock. Someone had sealed it. And for 3,000 years, it had waited. Carter covered the stairway again to protect it from looters and from the press. Then he sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. It read, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Resumed same latitude only. Congratulations." Carnarvon boarded a ship for Egypt. The final season had already succeeded, before it had truly begun. By the 23rd of November, the full stairway had been cleared. 16 steps descended to a flat area, a small platform, and then 4 more steps to a sealed doorway. The door was blocked with limestone and plaster, and across the plaster were seals. Not broken, not disturbed. The seal of the royal necropolis, the administrative stamp of the cemetery officials who controlled burials in the valley. This was critical. It meant the tomb had not been opened and left open in ancient times. Whatever was inside had been sealed by officials, and that seal had remained in place for more than 3 millennia. Carter did not break the door immediately. He waited for Carnarvon to arrive. On the 26th of November, with Carnarvon present, Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of the doorway. He widened it just enough to insert a candle and look inside. Hot air rushed out, candle flame flickered, and Carter saw a room filled with objects. That was the moment of the famous exchange. But what Carter understood, and what he said later, was that this was not the moment of discovery. It was the moment of confirmation. The real work was only beginning. It is important to understand Carter's reaction. He did not smash down the door. He did not grab gold. He did not allow a crowd to enter. He resealed the hole and stepped back. Why? Because Carter was not a treasure hunter. He was an archaeologist. In an age when that distinction was still being defined. He knew that tombs were not simply vaults of gold. They were fragile environments. Inside, organic materials, wood, linen, flowers, food, leather, had survived because the tomb was sealed. Sudden exposure to heat, light, and dry outside air could cause immediate damage. Carter had seen it happen before at other sites. He also knew that every object inside had context: where it stood, what it touched, what lay beneath it and above it. Remove an object without recording its position, and you lose information that can never be recovered. So Carter made a decision that would define the excavation. Everything would be documented. Everything would be photographed. Everything would be numbered, described, and removed in order. The discovery of 1922 would become famous not only for what was found, but for how it was found. The tomb was designated KV62, the 62nd tomb recorded in the Valley of the Kings. It was small, far smaller than the great tombs of pharaohs like Seti I or Ramesses II. The entire burial complex consisted of 4 main rooms: the antechamber, the first room Carter glimpsed through the hole; the annex, a side room packed with objects; the burial chamber, the heart of the tomb; and the treasury, a room for ritual equipment. There were no long corridors, no maze of passages. For a king of Egypt, this was modest, almost cramped. Later scholars would suggest that the tomb was not originally intended for Tutankhamun at all. It may have been prepared for a noble, possibly I, the official who later became pharaoh, and adapted in haste when Tutankhamun died suddenly as a young man. That theory is still debated. What is certain is this: the tomb was finished quickly, the burial was completed under pressure, and yet, against all odds, it survived. On the 29th of November 1922, Carter officially entered the antechamber. He described it later as a scene of organized chaos. Objects filled the room from a floor to ceiling. 2 life-sized statues of Tutankhamun stood facing each other, painted black, wearing gold regalia, holding staffs. They acted as guardians of the sealed door to the burial chamber. There were couches shaped like animals, including a hippopotamus and a lion. There were dismantled chariots, 6 of them, stacked against the walls. Chests filled with clothing, weapons, and furniture. Alabaster vessels, painted boxes, lamps, baskets, and everywhere, gold leaf, gilded wood, inlaid ivory. Carter wrote that the room looked less like a tomb and more like the contents of a palace storeroom, hurriedly packed and sealed. Every object had meaning. In Egyptian belief, the dead did not pass into a blank eternity. They entered the afterlife, a continuation of life, with the same needs: food, clothing, furniture, transport, protection, companionship. The antechamber was not decoration. It was equipment for survival in the next world. Beyond the antechamber lay the burial chamber, separated by another sealed doorway. When Carter finally entered, he found the room dominated by a single object: an enormous gilded wooden shrine, almost filling the entire chamber wall to wall. Inside that shrine was a second shrine. Inside that, a third, and a fourth. 4 nested shrines, each covered in gold and inscribed with protective texts. Within the final shrine stood a quartzite sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus, 3 coffins, nested one within another. The outer coffin was gilded wood. The middle coffin was gilded wood with inlaid glass and semi-precious stones. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold, weighing more than 100 kilograms. And inside that golden coffin lay the mummified body of Tutankhamun. On his head, Ikon, the golden funeral mask, more than 10 kilograms of gold, lapis lazuli, colored glass, inlaid carnelian. The face is idealized, as Egyptian royal art always was, but it is also personal. This is not a generic symbol of kingship. It is the funeral portrait of a specific young man who died around 1323 BC. When the mask was lifted and the mummy examined, Carter's team found a body roughly 165 centimeters tall, a teenager or very young adult. The boy king of history books was not a myth. He was a body in a coffin, with broken bones, worn teeth, and evidence of illness. The annex was perhaps the most difficult room to excavate. It was packed so tightly with objects that Carter's team could barely move inside. There were more than 2,000 items in this single room: oils, wine jars, food containers, furniture, baskets, and boxes. Removing one object required moving 3 others. Everything had to be mapped, photographed, and recorded before it was touched. The treasury contained even more ritual items, including model boats for the king's journey through the afterlife and the mummified remains of two stillborn children believed to be Tutankhamun's daughters. It is a human detail, quiet and devastating, inside a burial of gold. Before 1922, Tutankhamun was almost unknown. He appears briefly in king lists. He left few major monuments. He died young. His fame today is entirely the result of his tomb, not his reign. Tutankhamun became pharaoh as a child around the age of 9 in the late 18th dynasty, one of the most turbulent periods in Egyptian history. He inherited the throne after the death of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who had tried to replace Egypt's traditional gods with a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk. Akhenaten's revolution had shaken the country. Temples were closed. Old rituals were abandoned. The priesthood of Amun was stripped of power. Tutankhamun's reign, guided by advisors such as I and the General Horemheb, reversed many of those changes. The old gods were restored. The capital returned to Thebes. Temples were rebuilt. Inscriptions from his reign describe the restoration of order after a period of chaos. But Tutankhamun himself left little personal voice in history. He was a boy. He ruled for roughly 10 years. He died around the age of 18 or 19. Modern medical studies of his mummy, using CT scans and DNA analysis, have revealed multiple health problems: a club foot, malaria, possible bone disease. He also suffered a broken leg shortly before death, possibly from a fall. Whether that injury directly caused his death is still debated among specialists. What is not debated, he died unexpectedly. His tomb was prepared in haste, and his name was almost erased from history after his death. Carter's team found clear evidence that robbers had entered the tomb twice in antiquity, likely within years of the burial. They broke through doors. They took small portable items, jewelry, oils, perfumes, but the robberies were interrupted. Officials inspected the tomb, resealed the doors, and restored order. Traces of their repair work were still visible when Carter arrived. This is one of the reasons the tomb survived at all. The robbers never reached the nested shrines and coffins in the burial chamber. Over the centuries, debris from later tomb construction in the valley buried Cave 62 under rubble and stone chips. The entrance disappeared. The world forgot it was there. When Carter found the stairway in 1922, he was not opening a tomb that had remained untouched since 1323 BC. He was reopening a tomb that had been broken into, resealed, and then lost. That makes the survival of the burial even more remarkable. The discovery was announced to the world in February 1923, when the antechamber was officially opened to invited guests and press. Photographs spread across newspapers on every continent. But the excavation itself continued for nearly a decade. Carter's team cataloged 5,398 objects. Every item was photographed, often multiple times, from different angles. Every item was numbered. Every item was described in handwritten records. Wooden boxes were conserved in special treatments to prevent cracking. Textiles were stabilized. Gold was cleaned with painstaking care. Carter published the first volume of his scientific report in 1923. Further volumes followed over the years. This was not a single season of digging. It was a long-term archaeological project, one of the most thorough tomb excavations ever conducted. The discovery did not happen in a vacuum. Egypt in the 1920s was moving toward independence from British control. Egyptian nationalism was rising. The rules governing archaeological finds were changing. Who owned the contents of the tomb? Carter and Carnarvon assumed they would receive a share, according to the concession agreements of the time. The Egyptian government disagreed. A legal dispute followed. Carnarvon did not lived to see its resolution. He died in April 1923 from an infected mosquito bite in Cairo. After years of conflict, Carter eventually accepted that the entire contents of the tomb belonged to Egypt. Today, the great majority of Tutankhamun's objects remain in Egyptian museums. Most famously, the Grand Egyptian Museum near the Giza Pyramids and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. That outcome shaped modern archaeology in Egypt. Foreign excavators could no longer expect to divide finds with European museums as they had in the 19th century. The tomb of Tutankhamun became a symbol not only of ancient Egypt, but of Egypt's modern claim to its own past. Within weeks of Carnarvon's death, newspapers invented a story: the curse of the pharaoh. Anyone who disturbed the tomb would die. It was perfect for headlines. It was also nonsense. Lord Carnarvon died from an infection, documented by his doctors. Howard Carter lived until 1939, 17 years after the discovery. Most members of the excavation team lived normal lifespans. Statistical studies of those present at the opening found no unusual pattern of deaths. The curse was fiction, but it sold newspapers, and it still sells documentaries. At Echo of Empires, we leave it aside. What is real is the tomb. What is real are the objects. What is real is the record Carter left behind. Before 1922, archaeologists knew what Egyptian royal burials looked like, mainly from paintings, texts, and robbed, empty tombs. After 1922, they could study a burial almost as the ancient Egyptians had left it. The tomb showed that royal graves were not only about gold, they contained board games, walking sticks, linen underwear, partially eaten meals, wine labeled with the year of harvest in the vineyard, flowers placed fresh at the time of burial, preserved for 3,000 years. It showed that the afterlife, in Egyptian thought, was not abstract. It was practical. You would eat, you would walk, you would ride chariots, you would play senet, the board game found in multiple boxes in the tomb. Tutankhamun's burial was a complete world, packed into 4 small rooms. Howard Carter never found another tomb like Cave 62. He spent his remaining years writing, lecturing, and defending his work. He died in London in 1939, largely unrecognized by the British academic establishment that had always looked down on a man without a university degree. But among archaeologists, his reputation endured. Not because he was lucky, though luck played a part, but because, when luck came, he was ready. He did not destroy what he found. He documented it. He preserved it. He gave the world a record that still informs Egyptology today. The golden mask became an icon, but the greater treasure was the archive, the photographs, the notes, the numbered catalog of thousands of objects. That is what makes KV 62 a discovery, not a legend. On the 4th of November 1922, a workman cleared rubble and found a step in the rock. On the 26th of November, Howard Carter looked through a hole in a sealed door and saw wonderful things. Over the next 10 years, he and his team removed nearly 5,400 objects from 4 rooms and gave the modern world its clearest view of an Egyptian royal burial. Not a curse, not a secret chamber of aliens or lost civilizations, a young king, a hurried tomb, a burial interrupted by robbers, resealed by priests, forgotten by history, and found by patience. That is what Carter actually found. If you want more history told this way, documented, clear, and stripped of myth, subscribe to Echo of Empires. Thank you for watching.